Before we begin this afternoon's presentations, we would like to acknowledge that this meeting is being held on the traditional lands of the Noongar people. And for our speakers this afternoon, I would like to just give a brief introduction to each and have a discussion after each paper is presented and the presentation is complete for each person. And because biographies are available to you on the website, I'll give everyone a brief introduction to allow the most time for the presentation. Our first speaker today is Belinda Battley, and I would like to welcome Belinda from Archives New Zealand and Monash University, who will present her work relating to her PhD, which was submitted in August. And her work is entitled Authenticity in Places of Belonging. Would you like to come up, Belinda?
Hi everyone, kia ora koutou. Thanks very much for choosing to come to this session, because I know you had some really great other sessions to go to as well, so it's lovely to have so many of you here. So today, as you can see, my subject is archival authenticity and what the concept of places of belonging might mean for archives. So as I said in my abstract, which you might have read, for many, many years now, archivists have been rescuing records from communities, putting them in acid-free boxes and climate-controlled repositories to protect them from the wear and tear of the everyday, saving them for the future. So we do our best to be experts in arrangement and description, to maintain context, and to help people discover the archives they need. We have lots of skills in preservation and conservation of physical and digital artefacts to keep them available for future researchers. And we come up with all kinds of outreach activities to encourage people in to visit the archives that we've saved. And from that introduction, you can probably guess that there's going to be a however. So my research has suggested something rather awkward. It suggests our preservation efforts have missed something vital, an understanding of the way our community itself acts as a complex adaptive record-keeping system, maintaining community records through networks made up of things like personal relationships, cultural practices, stories, embodied knowledge, repeated events and special places. So when we remove records from communities and don't take these elements into account, what we're effectively doing is imposing our archival culture on those community records. So it's a kind of colonisation, and it assumes our record-keeping methods are superior to the community's existing systems. It constructs barriers between the community and the records, and it removes much of the context of the records. So authenticity of records in communities is determined by the community itself. The records are embedded in the community's processes and places of belonging. So maybe this makes sense to you, or maybe this is a bit of a bold assertion. So for the rest of this talk, I'll explain how I reached this conclusion and what that might mean for what we do as archivists and record-keeping professionals. So let's start with a personal story that most of us can probably relate to. So most of you have probably been in the situation where you get a new records management system or ARANZ at work. And sometimes what happens is you get consultants in to set it up. And sometimes they don't spend a lot of time consulting with you. Or maybe they have to use you have to use an off-the-shelf one that's maybe been tweaked a bit to suit the way that you like to do things to a degree. But maybe it doesn't quite suit your way of working or thinking. And a similar thing happens when you start a new job and you have to learn how everything works. So if you're like me, you learn by watching what other people do, asking questions, maybe reading manuals, if the manuals are set out in a way that makes sense to you, some trial and error, but basically learning in a kind of apprenticeship that combines all of these things. And at first it usually feels a bit foreign and everything takes a while and it's a bit tricky because it's not how you're used to doing things. So I don't really feel at home until I'm comfortable with how the systems work. So my PhD research looked at the relationships between collective memory and record keeping in one of my own communities, the Auckland University Tramping Club. So this picture shows a whole lot of record keeping processes happening in a tramping club context. So there I am in the middle, quite a few years ago, as you can see, reading a map supported by the advice of more experienced trampers who are sharing their knowledge with me, both by telling me directly and by my watching what they do. So we're on a tramping trip where we're all gaining more skills and knowledge, and that includes embodied knowledge. We're learning the skills of tramping by doing it. On this tramping club trip, we're also creating stories together and reinforcing bonds with one another. So our experience and the records we create and how we store them is strongly influenced by the place we're tramping. The state of the track, the state of the weather, the type of forest we're in, and the terrain all have a strong influence on the experience we have, what we're learning, the stories we are creating, the photos we take, or whether we take photos at all if it's pouring with rain, and whether we're ever going to go tramping again. So in a definition of record keeping in records continuum terms, Sue McKemish described the way archives and records are transformed into a corporate or personal archive by record keeping and archiving processes that place records as evidence in the broader context of the social and business activities and functions of the organisation, group or individual, and manage them in frameworks that enable them to function as individual, group or corporate memory. So the club's collective memory maintenance is a system of record keeping and archiving processes that place the community's records as evidence, as well as records for memory, within the specific and club-designed activities and functions of the club, and manage them in community-appropriate frameworks which help the club continue to flourish. However, the club's model of record keeping has highlighted a gap in the definition, and it hides the significance of place, which is an essential part of the club's complex adaptive system. I've used this slide before, as you can see, so places that we belong are an important aspect of membership of any community and of maintaining and using the records of collective memories. So in all of my recent research, the best place to communicate with the people that I needed to talk to were community places, where people feel at home, where they're comfortable and open, and where we're surrounded by all of the cues that spark ideas relating to the community, where we do club activities, where we create, keep, find and recognise our records for what they are, and where we can just happen upon the people that we want to talk with. So that might be physical places or it might be online places. So this slide contrasts interacting with records in a club place and in an archival repository. So in the hut at the top, the records have an immediacy and an affect, meaning and value and context. We can relate to the experiences of the people who wrote them. We can viscerally understand much of what they were feeling, smelling, seeing, thinking about, and what they're writing about might relate directly to what we've just done or what we're about to do. Maybe it'll provide useful advice about the next day's track, or maybe it tells us that our friends have been there. In a clean, quiet reading room, much of that experience isn't available. Instead, there's an aura of preciousness surrounding you. So the totally different experience and context helps to create and recreate the records and largely separates them from the living community that was their source. So we need to question whether putting community records in an archival institution, which isn't a community place, is really preserving them for the community, or instead are we preserving it for ourselves and other traditional users of archives? So this is the model of the tramping club process for maintaining collective memory that I developed in the course of my research. So we found that the role of records is completely embedded in the life of this community, all within the original aims of the club, which are written on the circumference of the circle there. Collective memories tied up with the nature of the activity, the practice of tramping and the places we tramp, the shared values and interests of club members, the regular repeated events held, the stories and songs we share, the informal apprenticeship that each member goes through, the sharing of the work of memory between people within the structure of the club, the presence of elders with a long view, and the trust or membership which keeps us all together. So together they form a complex adaptive system for maintaining collective memory. So what does I mean by a complex adaptive system? Hope you can read that. So I took this photo on a tramping trip with my family. It's a South Island robin in the middle there. The environment that the robin lives in is an example of a complex adaptive system which has so far enabled the survival of the species and others like it, though it's always being challenged by external influences. So to help its preservation, people have spent a lot of time studying its behaviour in its natural environment to work out what interventions are needed, if any, to help it survive. And similarly, my research has shown that the club systems for maintaining memory and evidence are complex, adaptive and interdependent, which is in line with the generic characteristics of complex adaptive systems which are identified on this slide, described by Middleton Kelly in 2003. So to explain how they relate to the club and its record keeping and collective memory processes, first of all, self-organisation. The club members decide what the club will do, deciding individually to come together to do activities, create, use and maintain records and so on. emergence, which was defined by Mytleton Kelly as the process that creates new order together with self-organisation. So changes to the club arise from the interaction between all of the elements of the club, with feedback from all of the related entities. New actions, records, cultural elements and so on emerge through the interaction of the whole of the club, including all of the external forces influencing all of the internal elements. Oops, sorry, didn't mean to do that. Connectivity and interdependence. So this relates to all the elements of the system: humans, records, places, events, aims, values and so on. And decisions or actions of individuals or characteristics of places or records or events can affect others in the club. So for example, individuals decide to run trips or training in particular places. They decide to help maintain the hut, take on the safety officer role, digitise club archives and make them available online and so on. So the impact of decisions of individuals or characteristics of other elements on any other individual element depends on the state of the individual receiving the impact. So it can be greater or lesser. So for example, the individual might have already been on that training course, or they might not have time to go, or conversely, maybe the trip is the turning point in their life and they decide to devote their life to conservation of the environment. Another example would be the digital system chosen for maintaining the photographs may or may not be effective. And the person creating the images and maintaining the system may or may not be skilled and knowledgeable about digital preservation. So the next one is feedback, and feedback's an intrinsic part of the club's process, built into the system through committee meetings, including, for example, decisions on who's qualified to lead or go on a trip, conversations, individual decisions about whether or not and how to run and attend events as a result of previous experiences, and informed by input from the external environment. Far from equilibrium, the tramping club's in a state of constant flux as the membership and committees renewed each year. And the constant change of membership and decision makers allowed for constant experimentation and exploration of possibilities as society changes around the club. So the recent development of Kauri dieback disease in the vicinity of the club hut has led to the closing of the forest and limited access to the hut, which has been a vital part of the club's collective memory processes. And this is likely to have an ongoing detrimental effect on club activities, memory and record-keeping system, unless the club can develop strategies to deal with this new really significant challenge. And this has already started. For example, the club started to volunteer to improve tracks in the Waitakere ranges to reduce the risk of soil movement around kauri trees and soon to provide access to the hut again. Space of possibilities. Mytleton Kelly says any strategy can only be optimal under certain conditions, and when these conditions change, the strategy may no longer be optimal. So the constant renewal of club leadership and membership allows for the exploration of an expansive space of possibilities, new possible strategies to try within the safety net of longer serving committee members who can provide a buffer against any change they think is detrimental to broader club aims. Next, there's co-evolution. Elements of the club system evolve together over time through feedback due to connectivity. So, for example, when the club introduced a Facebook page, it was at first only the current student members who were aware of it and used it. But then older former members became aware of it through their club member Facebook friends making posts or liking photos posted there, and so they started to use it too. Historicity and time. Subsequent evolution of the club depends on decisions made within the system. So the state of the club at any time is dependent on what's happened to all of the elements in its history. So, for example, the decision to have a club hut has had a powerful and ongoing influence on the club, its members, its events and its records as well, as has the decision to have an annual magazine. And the decision of an individual club member to lead a trip to a particular valley on a particular date when the mountainside unexpectedly collapsed. Path dependence. So as above, the specific paths a system may follow depends on its past history. And so in the example I just gave, the loss of 4 club members in a tragic tramping accident within the same year as several climbing accidents led to a greater emphasis on safety in the mountains, encouraged by influential individuals such as the President. Some individuals believe that as many of these accidents had a large element of chance, they didn't see a need to modify the behaviour, but for the club as a whole, the powerful negative feedback of the loss of close friends led to an impulse to improve training in alpine skills, which in turn led to the introduction of new training courses and requirements. And that led to new trips, new skills for individuals, more new possibilities, which all provided positive feedback for the new path, and again, new types of records being created as a result, and new memories and skills. Creation of new order. So Middleton Kelly describes self-organisation, emergence, and the creation of a new order as three of the key elements of complex systems. And new order is created through the interrelationship of all elements of the system working together in a complex, adaptive system in constant flux. So every new order is a temporary creation, but because of the background of unchanged shared aims, an effective structure, and the continuing interconnection of all elements of the system and process, it forms a coherent and cohesive organisation. So all of the elements of the complex adaptive system working together give the club's collective memory and culture its richness and resilience in the face of constant change. But traditional ways of managing archives aren't designed to deal with this level of complexity and interdependence. So now we can contrast the previous images of Tramping Club places with this archival palace, and we can see that the community's collective memory is a holistic and complex adaptive system with all of the elements intertwined and reliant on one another to maintain the context and meaning of the records and information they contain. So now we can look at how adequate existing models of archival theory are for representing the place of records and record keeping in the system. And we can also examine existing models of practice to work out whether they can meet the newly understood needs of the community. So in my research, I found that when records are removed from the system and placed into an archival institution or otherwise are separated from the current club, these connections with the records and control over them and knowledge of their context, awareness of their existence, and the ability to judge the authenticity in club terms tends to be lost to club members. Even the club president wasn't really aware of what records of the club were held in the university archives. And a former president who had been responsible for putting the records in the archives told me when he went there to look at some photo albums that he used to take to club reunions to share with other people, now he had to go in and sit at a desk at the archives by himself and put white gloves on. So transferring community records to an archival institution supports the processes of colonisation in this way. Community memory sources are removed from their place in the community's processes to the control of an external power. Any community member who wants to visit their records has to follow the institution's cultural requirements and experience all the affective and practical impacts of that new context. So Casey, who was an American geographer and philosopher, said, "The relationship between self and place is not just one of reciprocal influence, but also more radically of constitutive co-ingredients. Each is essential to the being of the other." And my research suggests that records and place also have a constitutive co-ingredients. Place is more than just an instantaneously passing aspect of space-time. It has a strong and often enduring contextual influence on experience, affect, and records creation, preservation, access, use, and interpretation. So I can use these findings to critique archival descriptive practice models, and you can ask me more about that in the questions later if you want to. So this is a photo from my album from the 1980s. It's an album with horrible sticky pages, no written metadata at all, and as a professional archivist, I'd be really disapproving. In a professional archival sense, it appears that the photo isn't being preserved for the future. But then again, I can take this photo to a club reunion and tell people many things about it. It's Debbie trimming Adrian's beard at the club hut, Ongaruanuku, in the Waitakere Ranges, which is a 40-minute walk along a muddy track called Ridge Road. And there are balloons there because it's Hut birthday. My sister's sitting there on the steps sharing a joke with Linda, who has her back to the camera. Mike's sitting next to her, Craig's at the top left, and Quentin's next to him. Those parking signs were stolen by... No, I won't say that. There's a lot of context and description, and I could choose whether to add more. At any point, I could choose to share this with anyone, and I often have with my fellow club members at club events, and with my children who went on to become club members. And when they did, they already knew a lot about the hut and about Hut birthday because I'd shown them this photo and talked about this and other things as well. They already knew a whole lot about club traditions and carried them on with their own modernised spin. They still celebrate Hut birthday, but they advertise it through the club's Facebook page and email instead of a physical notice board. So the photo was created because a group of us had gathered for an event at this community place, which we've decorated with a hand-painted shield as well as the random signs, and club members regularly got together there, using it as a base for training new members in tramping skills, sharing traditions, games, stories and songs. They paint it, replace walls and part of the roof, so it's a club-created place in every sense of the word. So this photo symbolises just some of the ways the club uses the nexus of records in place to maintain its collective memory. Individual physical records in the club don't necessarily have to survive for the long term to continue to have an influence, but they do need to be shared in club places for as long as they have significance for club members. So at a record-keeping roundtable discussion in 2014, Anne Gilliland asked the question, what do records do in people's lives that nothing else does? And this research has found an answer to that question in the case of the Tramping Club community. So the use of records has been seen to be vitally incorporated in all of the activities central to the life and sustainability of the community, including remembering, forgetting, witnessing, accounting for, connecting to place and people and culture, belonging, transmitting knowledge, communicating and informing, and spiritual and emotional well-being. For the records to continue their function as an active part of the life of the club, they need to remain within the complex adaptive system of the club's collective memory keeping processes. And vital to that process are the places in which the club carries out its activities, the wilderness areas, the club notice board, the Facebook page, the hut, the other non-physical records which link to the physical ones, the stories and songs, the embodied skills and knowledge, and the relationships and shared understanding that all in combination give meaning, context to the records. So I have all sorts of questions, but I have no more time, so I'll just skip to the questions, things to think about. Yeah. So I have 2 more pages, but no more time, so that's probably enough for me to say right now. I've thrown everything up in the air and suggested that everything that we're doing is wrong.